De heer Wouter Turkenburg zei het al, veel dank aan een heleboel instellingen. Wie ik vooral nog wil bedanken is de Stichting Artimidiair van al zijn medewerkers en met name Cor Hendricks. Cor, waar ben je? Kijk daarachter met het petje op, zou ik maar zeggen. Cor, door jouw onvermoeibare inzet kon dit project slagen. Echt zeer veel dank ben ik je verschuldigd. Wie ik ook wil bedanken uiteraard zijn alle vrijwilligers die dagelijks hier helpen om de tentoonstelling te bemannen. En...
Miles Davis. Ja, we zitten hier in de buurt van zijn schilderijen, maar wat betekende Miles Davis nou eigenlijk als jazzmuzikant? We praten met Andy Clark. Andy, talking about Miles Davis, you've seen him play. I haven't. Most people haven't, but we only heard his music. Now, for me, jazz is something that came from the poor blacks in the South, and they kind of took over the music scene in America, and people like Dizzy Gillespie and Satchmo made jazz. But that's not quite a correct image for Miles Davis, is it?
Miles came from a very wealthy, well-to-do background. His father was a dentist. He studied at the Juilliard School of Music. And
so he had a classic training in music.
Indeed. In later life, he affected the street style because he felt that was the way to get himself across. But he was, as I say, very well-to-do. He didn't come from the high-five slapping style of background. He wasn't a street kid or anything like that, but a well-trained musician. And he started back in the 40s, and he was playing as a very young boy, age 16, playing with Charlie Parker, with the great names of the early jazz. And he kept changing. His styles kept changing, he kept moving on. He didn't believe that you hit a successful streak and keep with it. Like rock musicians nowadays, they make one success, they just keep reproducing it and repeating it to carry on and on and on. He kept changing his band, never had the same musicians all the time, but everybody wanted to play with him. He was an innovator.
And he did all kinds of music. He wasn't performing, but he also did like film music.
Yep, he did the Ascent to the Scaffold with Jean Moreau, who he ended up having a big affair with, one of the great loves of his life. And he has done several films. There was an Australian film, Dingo, which he produced the music for. And he was a great experimenter. He never wanted to stand still. You know, once it was down, it was down. No going back. He would record everything, but he would never practice it beforehand. He would just go in and play. And the other musicians had to keep up with him. And he was always challenging them.
Now, since his background was different, how did he get along with his fellow musicians? I mean, obviously he played with many of them, but was he befriended with them, or was he?
I think he was obviously he was friends with some musicians, but I think he was quite a hard taskmaster to play with, and he didn't suffer fools, and he expected people.
What do you say? He didn't suffer fools.
Suffer fools, an English expression. Sorry.
If you didn't live up to his standards, you were out.
Yeah, he wasn't there to teach you how to do it. You were expected. He would say, this is what we're playing, go to it, and expected them to know it, with the result that he attracted the very best names. And his band, members of his later bands, now are the great names of jazz. Dave Holland, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, all who played with him at the time I saw him, which was 1970, at the time of Bitches Brew, which was probably his most experimental period, when he was going into jazz fusion. And some people find it unapproachable because there are an awful lot of squeaks and grunts. But underneath it all is, again, an innovation. He didn't follow, he was the leader. And I think that is shown nowadays by, apparently statistically, he represents half the jazz sales in the world of records, even now, 9 years after his death. And people keep discovering him. And it's impossible to open a music paper these days without his name appearing. Recently, Santana was interviewed about his big new album, the one that won all the Grammys. And as he said, every night he goes to sleep and talks to Miles, as he was a friend of Miles, and used him as a sounding board. So he crops up all the time and was a major influence. And you hear
What were his belief systems? I mean, does he come from a spiritual background? Obviously, what we can see from his paintings here, he had some very heavy love affairs in his life.
He liked the ladies. He liked the ladies. But there were, again, as with his music, there was no compromise. They went with him, or they didn't. And so, as his period of his life changed, so the women in his life changed. As most people will know, he had problems with drugs and drink, which in the end killed him. The accumulative effect killed him. But when he stopped drugs in the early 80s, as he himself said, he had to have something to do. And so he started drawing and painting. And he was always there with a notepad, sketching away, painting away.
Many of the works we see here have like an experimental, like a sketchbook character. He was always practicing. And
always sketching. And a lot of these are portraits of his girlfriend at the time, Julie Troyer, in New York. They lived together. And there's a theme, almost a theme running through most of the work. You can see that there are variations of the same face, the same movement, but at the same time there's a reflection of his music in it. It doesn't stand still. There's a feeling of movement in each picture. None of it is static. And even the colours are somewhat reminiscent of the different tones of his music. There are calm pictures, there are violent pictures, there are pictures that move fast, there are others that just glide, which reflects his music. And I would say that looking at this whole collection, one is getting a fair range of Miles's emotions.
Could we say that since Miles Davis's days, jazz has flattened out, these extremes? When you go to the North Sea Jazz Festival, we have major singers there that I wouldn't primarily see as jazz singers.
I think the barriers between jazz and rock and soul music have blurred. In the 50s, the 60s, and probably the early 70s, there was a distinct difference between jazz and pop music and rock music. But then Miles was one of those who crossed over the barriers. He worked with musicians who were predominantly from the rock field and changed the face of a lot of jazz that way and showed people that there was no set limits. As he said, there's no jazz, there's no rock, there's no pop, there's just good music and bad music. And that was the way he worked. He would appreciate great musicians, regardless of what field they were working in. And he sought out the best musicians to play with him.
Okay, and that is why we still remember and still listen to Miles Davis and his music. And Andy, thank you for...
Yeah. Thank you.